Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Torah portion is Vayera. The rabbis learned from Moses the importance of Hakarta HaTov, recognizing good and showing gratitude, even to inanimate objects. We explore this character trait of gratitude as it relates to personal conduct and current Israeli politics. So join us as we thank the donkey of the Messiah. Well, Rabbi, welcome. You are in Dubai. I'm in Tel Aviv. As I said in the intro, we are going to talk about gratitude, which is a wonderful subject to talk about. And it occurs in a very strange place. So in Exodus 7, it says, "And God said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your rod and hold out your arm over the waters of Egypt." And this was the first plague. It was the plague of turning the Nile, which was the heartbeat of Egypt, into blood. In Exodus 8:1, we get to the second plague. And here it says, "And God said to Moses, say to Aaron, hold out your arm with the rod over the rivers, the canals." And this was plague number 2, the frogs. And then we get to the third plague in Exodus 8:12. "And then God said to Moses, say to Aaron, hold out your rod and strike the dust of the earth, and it shall turn to lice throughout the land of Egypt." Now, besides being miraculous plagues, there's nothing particularly interesting about what I just told you. And if we didn't have the sages, we might just pass over this and move right on to plague number 4. But starting with plague number 4, going all the way to the last of the 10 plagues, all of the plagues are executed by Moses. And the rabbis were very quick to notice that the first 3 plagues were not executed by Moses, but they were executed by Aaron at God's request. And so they were struck by that, and I say kudos to them, but how they answered it is kind of really surprising. They could have gone in many directions, don't you think, Rabbi Adam?
They sure could have. It's a fantastic, rabbinic tradition about what makes the first 3 plagues different. And you're right, it's kind of a typical rabbinic thing to notice. The difference. When everything is the same, the rabbis notice the difference.
If I was keeping to the narrative, I think it would be very easy to say that throughout the narrative, last week Moses says, "Ani lo ish devarim." I am not a man of words. Moses is portrayed as somebody who is very shy. You could very well come up with an explanation that until Moses got the hang of it, until he warmed up, God said, let Aaron do it. But what seems also unique about the answer that the rabbis give is there's only one kind of string that poses the question, and there's really, as far as I can tell, one answer that they give, and that's kind of rare that you have that kind of unanimity. The answer I'll give, and then I'd love your comments, is that Rashi in 7:19 says, "Say unto Aaron," is the quote, "he said, because the river had protected Moses when he was cast into it, therefore it was not smitten by him, neither at the plague of blood, nor at that of frogs, but it was smitten by Aaron." And then in Exodus 8:12, he says that, again, quoting, "Say unto Aaron," he says, "the dust did not deserve to be smitten by Moses because it had protected him when he slew the Egyptian, for he hid him in the sand, and it was therefore smitten by Aaron. So he quotes a singular midrash in the name of Rabbi Tafrin, who said that, again, the dust protected Moses. If you recall, he struck the Egyptian slave master who was beating up his two fellow Jews. He looked here, he looked there, and he buried him in the sand, and he escaped. And because of that, we are told he could not strike these inanimate objects because they saved him. What do you make of it, Rabbi?
So the first interesting thing is that the three plagues have the same punchline, that they were done by Aaron, but the explanation is different. I think we need to notice that. The first two have to do with water, and water protected Moshe. The third, it has to do with the dust, and the dust protected Moshe. Now that's kind of funny, the dust protected Moshe, because the dust didn't really protect Moshe. The dust was just the way in which Moshe buried the Egyptians so that nobody would see. Now, the truth of the matter is that somebody did see, because the Torah says he went out the next day and two people were fighting, and he said, "Well, you're going to do to me like you did to the Egyptians." So clearly people saw. So to me, the third example of the dust is actually a stretch. The idea of the water makes a lot of sense. The dust is kind of, once you already go down that path, they kind of look for a way in which the dust helps them out.
So as you were talking, I started looking at the Hebrew to see what exact language it used to describe protected. And the word it uses is shehegen. And because in the intro I promised, we will get to Israeli politics, you can't but miss the word hagen is to protect in the same way as the Haganah was the early troops of Israel was to protect. So they protected him but as you point out, they didn't really do anything. I'm not sure I catch the nuance between the water and the dust, because in both cases, the water and the dust were just that. They were water and dust. And water, they were passive, and they were just there. And from a tradition that doesn't believe in worshiping inanimate objects, that has almost a one line, one pony, one hit about idol worship. And that is, don't worship something of stone and clay that you made a few seconds ago. It does strike me as a little strange that here Moses, and really, as one of the commentaries points out, and this is kind of fascinating to me, it doesn't say that Moses said to Aaron to take over. In all three of the verses, it says God commanded that Aaron execute this. And the Birkat Asher, who's a fairly recent commentary, says, as a result, we can learn that Hakarta HaTov, which is kind of the universal word used to describe this particular message, recognizing good, gratitude, is not simply a good character trait. It is a commandment from God. Now, I don't think he's really saying it's one of the 613, but he's certainly saying that the Torah goes out of its way to say that this is a command from God. But it is odd that we are thanking an inanimate object for us Jews that are so adverse to thanking inanimate objects.
I would agree with you. I mean, sometimes the exaggeration makes the point. And that means, of course, you're not thanking inanimate objects. But I want to tell you, gratitude is so important. Look how far the Torah goes to express gratitude. It doesn't really mean that you need to express gratitude to inanimate objects, but the Torah exaggerates it to teach us how important it is.
I totally agree. It's kind of like a Rorschach test. I mean, it's funny. We're going to come across some verses where it's pretty clear that the message of the Torah is gratitude. I don't think anyone would say that it's clear from these verses that that is the message here. But nonetheless, and maybe it's because, you talk about where the rabbis come up with their explanations. I'm almost imagining that just as you and I kind of both know this is the traditional reason, I'm just wondering whether this was something that was passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, that, that's the reason why, because there's such a sense of unanimity. It's so far away from the simple meaning of the text. It's kind of not even there, that it's an amazing Rorschach test if we're going to make a case that Hakarta HaTov, that gratitude, that recognizing one's sources, one's those things that helped one get through the quagmire of life, is something that's very basic to Judaism. I think that the fact that there's unanimity coming about some kind of verses that just simply feature Aaron kind of tells us as much about us, as much as about the rabbis, as it does about the text that we're looking at.
I would agree with that. That's so interesting that you say that, it went from kind of father to son or mother to daughter, meaning that these kinds of traditions, which are so outside the simple meaning of the text, these were things that people grew up with. The same way we grew up with this story, we went to school, we went to yeshiva, and this is what we were taught. It goes all the way back. This is the way they explain the story. So you have to understand that for most people in the ancient world, these stories were oral. Yes, they had a written Torah, but these stories were oral. What do I mean they were oral? Most people couldn't read, and even the people who could read had no access to books. Like there could have been a written Torah, but no one had access to that written Torah. It took a long time. It takes a whole year to write a Torah. So nobody had access to these books. So these are stories, Geoffrey, that parents tell their children around the table. And these are the kind of things. Some of them stick and some of them don't. This is the kind of thing that sticks. The same way we remember it from year to year, this is the kind of thing that sticks. So that's why there's unanimity here, because these are those kinds of stories. It's not shot. It's not literal, where you can argue. I can tell you this is the literal explanation, or this is the literal explanation. No, it's a tale, and tales generally are passed down just as tales.
I couldn't agree more. So now let's go to some verses where the message of gratitude is a little more obvious. So in Deuteronomy 23:8, and this relates to our story in a way, it says, "You shall not abhor an Edomite, for such is your kin. Ki achicha hu. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you were a stranger in that land. Ki ger hayiter ba'aretzo." And Rashi says, "Thou shalt not abhor in an Egyptian," and he adds the word, and we've discussed this before, mikol vakol, utterly. You can't utterly hate them, although they cast your male children into the river. And what is the reason that you shall not abhor him utterly? Because they were your hosts in time of need. During Joseph's reign, and the neighboring countries suffered from famine. Therefore, although they sinned against you, do not utterly abhor him. And I think in this word, in this pasuk, you cannot think of a reason other than recognizing, admitting the good of the Egyptians, even though they've done some terrible things to us. I mean, that takes this to a whole new level, but at least you can see that Rashi is not stretching here in terms of that's the kind of crux of this verse. The Edomites might be related to you somehow, but the Egyptians, they took you in when there was a famine, and that you always have to remember and be grateful for.
So I think that, you talked about inanimate objects. Actually, the Egyptians are the opposite. Not only are they animate, are they people, but actually they're bad people. And even though they're bad people, we still need to be grateful because they did something nice to us. So it's interesting that here we're thanking inanimate objects, and there we're thanking bad people. But if somebody does something good to you, you need to thank. You need to be grateful. That's also an extreme of gratitude. It seems to be, and we can look at the other verses you're about to quote, but it seems to be that when it comes to gratitude, because gratitude is so important, therefore there's an exaggeration element in the examples that the rabbis give, which is fascinating.
You know, it doesn't say so, but I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's almost an implication here that it's not simply you can't abhor them, but somehow it might have to affect not only the way you think, but maybe the way you act. It's hard to say, but certainly the two examples that we have are both surprising. Inanimate objects, that you should have any sort of relation with them. And of course, the answer there would typically be, it's not the sand, it's not the water, it's you. You need to develop that muscle. You have to exercise that muscle of gratitude. But here we're talking about not just any enemy, we're talking about the Egyptians. We're quoting this while we're in the middle of the Exodus story. And it cannot not but impact us that you still have to remember the good parts of them. And it seems to imply that somehow that might even affect how you act. I don't know, but clearly it's a fascinating, you think of Christianity, turning the other cheek, so to speak. But here definitely there is this sense of you need to exercise this muscle of gratitude to the extent that you can even find something to thank, something to appreciate, something to be thankful for in your enemy. And that's kind of powerful.
That's great. Now, let me just say, turning the other cheek is the opposite. Because turning the other cheek means you have to turn the other cheek even to someone who doesn't deserve it. See, here, our whole point is you have to express gratitude to someone or something who deserves it. The Christians say you have to be good to people even if they don't deserve it. That's a whole different religious value.
I get what you're saying. But clearly in the middle of this, it says, even though they threw your babies into the water to kill them, they are an enemy, but it's saying that you can parse it. And I think what you're saying is true, that you cannot overlook the injustice and the bad of the Egyptians. You have to be able to recognize the good nonetheless because of that, but not whitewash it. And I think turning the other cheek, you're probably correct, has more of a sense of just forget about the bad. And that's not just, and that's not right. So the Talmud in Baba Kama says the following. Rabbi said to Rabbi Bar Mari, from where is this matter derived where people say, if there is a well that you drank from, do not throw a stone into it? Bira shetatit mine lo tishtade be kala. Rabbi Bar Mari said to him that the source is, as it is written, you shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, because you were a stranger in his land. So this is a fascinating little pitgam, a little expression. A well that you drank from, do not throw a stone into it. Is that simply gratitude? Is there a sense here also of precedence, of chronology, of you drank from it yesterday, you might not need to drink from it anymore, but the good that it gave you perseveres? It seems to me this is kind of adding a little bit of texture to the discussion.
So that's really interesting, that the question here is, will you need it in the future? Maybe it's not exactly gratitude. Maybe it's, planning for the future. You misuse a well, what's going to happen in the future? So you're wondering whether that's the same message or a different message. I think that's fair. I don't think you can know the answer.
But it adds some texture. So I think part of gratitude, the flip side of gratitude is obviously ingratitude, an ingrate. And I think I can make the case, Rabbi, here on Madlik, that in a certain sense in Judaism, original sin was ingratitude. So where do I get this from? If you look at Genesis 3:12, Adam and Eve have eaten from the apple. Of course, Eve takes it first and gives it to her husband to eat. God comes through the Garden of Eden, asks where Adam is. Hineni, I'm here. And he says, what have you done? I gave you one commandment. What did you do? In Genesis 3:12, Adam said, the woman you put at my side, she gave me of the tree and I ate. Ha'isha asher natata imadi, she was the one. And of course, Rashi says, here he showed his ingratitude. Kafara b'tova. He uses this language of kafara, which is when we say that the wicked son talks we said his kofer be'ika. Even in Arabic, kafara means a kofer, a total rejection of everything that is right. And here he was kofer b'tova. And the Rashi gets this, as he gets everything that he says, from the Midrash and from the Talmud. And this comes from the Talmud in Avodah Zorah 5a. And the Gemara is talking about times where the Jewish people were had ingratitude, such as when they complained about the manna from heaven. They go, we got it every day. It doesn't taste so good anymore. And it says, the sages said, with regard to the verse, who would give that they had such a heart as always to fear me and keep all my commandments? God, Kiviyachol, is dreaming of what would happen if the Jewish people were really good and appreciated everything that he did. And he says, and Moses said to the Jewish people, you are ingrates, children of ingrates. When the Holy One, blessed be he, said to the Jewish people, would that he give me such a heart as this, he was referring to this. And when it came to the manna, it says, you are children of ingrates, as it is written, who are you children of? You are children of the original Adam, the original man, who after sinning and eating from the tree of knowledge said to God, the woman you gave me made me sin. So here we have kafui tova, the opposite of gratitude, ingratitude, is the original sin. That might have been the straw that broke the camel's back. What do you think, Rabbi?
That's so interesting that you connect the two cases to one another. You're right. I don't know the straw that broke the camel's back, but there definitely seems to be a connection between all of these cases. I like that a lot.
Well, we don't know exactly why they were punished. We all know that if our kids do something wrong, half of it is how they own up to it. Half of it is what happens after the crime. We know that Adam and Eve weren't supposed to eat of the tree, but what happened if he had been a little more diplomatic when God caught him in the act? Certainly this didn't help his case. Whether it was the straw that broke the camel's back, you're right. We have no clue. But it is kind of fascinating.
You read it, that's what's so beautiful about it, is you could read it any way, and that's the way you're reading it. And I have no response other than I like that reading. I can't tell you you're right, but I like that reading.
Well, thank you. That means a lot to me. So we're talking today about gratitude, and we are Madlik. This is a Jewish podcast, and so I started to think about what is this sense of thanks? And I started thinking about Yehudi and Yehudah. If you look at Genesis 29, it says that when Leah conceived again and bore a son and declared, this time I will praise God. Therefore she named him Judah. Then she stopped bearing. So the word Yehudah comes from the same word as Moda, comes from that we say Moda ani lefanecha, that we say Modim anachnu lach, we thank God. It comes
Todah, of course.
Hodaya, it's all of that in Brakot.
The most popular word that you're using this week in Israel, Todah, is the same word.
You're right, Todah Rabbah. So in Birakot 7:8, it says, Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, from the day the Holy One, blessed be He, created the world, no one thanked the Holy One, blessed be He, until Leah came and thanked Him, as it is stated, and quotes our verse. So now this is fascinating, because not only is this sense of being thankful clearly important, the thing of not being grateful, possibly the source of a lot of sin. But here, poor Kiviachol God has to wait till Leah has her fourth child before he gets thanked for anything. It's almost a piece of Talmud that has you feeling for the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And it would, if you just took this as an introduction to the Torah and then read the Torah from this perspective in terms of being grateful to God, you would go through a lot of it and say, boy, oh boy, whether it's mankind or the Jewish people, we certainly don't give enough thanks, do we?
I would say that is correct. And I think going back to the beginning, I think that's why the rabbis exaggerate the need for gratitude. It's because human beings tend not to be grateful enough that the rabbis have to exaggerate the need.
I think absolutely. And I think that if you look at the Torah from this lens, and let's talk a second about gratitude. We've given a few examples till now. It's not simply gratitude. When you give me something, I am grateful. But there's an element of moda, of hoda, of Hakarta HaTov, of recognizing it. And this gets back to our first example of an inanimate object. The inanimate object can do nothing with your gratitude, but the recognition on your part. People talk about many of the laws that we have, like sending away the mother bird before the child. There is this, I said it before, I'll say it again, this muscle that we need to exercise of recognizing from where comes our current situation. Thankful, recognizing it. There's in the Talmud, it talks about modeh b'miktzat, when you're in a litigation, just recognizing that maybe there is something to what the other said. We're coming to the end. I think this concept of Jews, and we find this in the Talmud all the time, quoting their sources, gets to what I was touching upon before, which is this chronology. There's this, what is the provenance? What is the history of an idea? It's so important in Jewish sources. There's a whole monologue that I quote in our source sheet, why Jews quote. But we do quote. That's why I put together a source sheet every week. Because if we, Rabbi, were just talking about things that entered into our head, it would be meaningless. But we quote our sources. We recognize our sources. We're thankful for our sources. It is absolutely very Jewish.
Very, very Jewish. So why don't we finish the last 2 minutes? You said we're talking about Israeli politics. Let's talk about Israeli politics.
Fantastic. So there is, in Israel today, we have what I would call hyper-Zionists. And the hyper-Zionists, whether they wear a kippah suga, a knitted yarmulke, or whether they are a Haredim, they are they looked at the last election as between the Jews, meaning them, and the Israelis. They look at secular society, whether it is the Haganah who is protecting them, whether it is early Zionists who were totally secular, who founded the state, And in a sense, they ignore them. And there is a line of thought. There was actually a book written about 10 years ago called The Chamor of Mashiach, the donkey of the Messiah. We all know that picture of the Messiah riding in on his donkey. What they did is they quoted Rav Kook, one of the great thinkers of religious Zionism. And Rav Kook not looked at the early Zionists who were clearly very secular, and he had to explain to his co-religionists how anything good could come out of them. And in the process, he developed a philosophy that we, the Messianic Jews, the Jews that are going to bring the final redemption, are riding on what the secular Jews created. You can call it a chamor, a donkey, or he actually had a play with words where he called it chomer, the material. We're getting back to the sand now, but the material that the land of Israel is built on. And I don't want to get into a deep philosophical discussion about what I agree with or what I don't agree with. But one thing that I think comes clear from our Parsha is that, one, we are taught to recognize our antecedents. We are taught to recognize what came before us and the importance. And more to the point, we have to have gratitude. And if we don't know who we are. And I think whether that was the intent of Rav Kook or whether it is a misinterpretation of Rav Kook, my one blaring critique of what is happening in the world of ultra-religious Zionism today is a lack of recognition and of Hakarta HaTov for the antecedents of the Jewish state. And I believe everything begins there.
I think that's a really good lesson to start to end with. And so we wish everybody Shabbat Shalom from Israel, from Dubai. Next week we'll do another Lunch and Learn, same time. Works for me. Geoffrey, I hope it works for you. And hopefully we'll see everybody next week.
Fantastic. We will do a Lunch and Learn next week, and the main message of today is, for God's sake, be thankful. Be thankful of what we have, recognize who we are, and we stand on the shoulders of giants. There's a history there. Shabbat Shalom, whether you're in Dubai, Morocco, or Israel. Shabbat Shalom.